afternoon. Good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to this EPC Policy Dialogue. We're going to be looking at prospects for peace in the South Caucasus 1 year after the Second Karabakh War. The war, which ended with the Russian brokered ceasefire, reversed the situation on the ground, with Azerbaijan taking back nearly all of the territory that it lost in the First War back in the 1990s. It also upended the geopolitical situation in the region. I think it's clear that Russia and Turkey have both expanded their roles. Iran has seen its position diminish, while the West, notably the US and the EU, have been sidelined to a large degree. And in the case of Washington, I think that they were busy elsewhere, notably in China. And in my position, this needs to change, but we can come back to that in the discussion. First of all, while the ceasefire ended the fighting, real peace and, very importantly, reconciliation still remains to be achieved, and particularly reconciliation is not going to be easy, particularly in a region where there's a lot of bad blood and a huge deficit of trust. But it's still possible if you can find a common vision for the future and the benefits are big enough. And of course, if there's sufficient political will and flexibility from all of the sides. But I mean, again, this is something that's probably going to take decades or even generations. Now, looking back to 1 year, we can see that a key weakness of the ceasefire agreement was that there was no political settlement attached to it. And obviously, a real political settlement is crucial going forwards to have lasting peace and also actually to get rid of the nearly 2,000 Russian peacekeepers that were deployed, and of which neither Azerbaijan or Armenia are particularly happy to have there. And again, while difficult political differences remain, and I'm sure we're going to be discussing some of these shortly, I think the prospect of new trade links and economic cooperation across the region does have huge potential. So we have a lot of issues to talk about. I mean, developments in this region happen very quickly, and sometimes it's quite difficult to keep track of everything, which is why I'm so happy that we have a really great panel with us today to give us an update on what's going on, what the main challenges and prospects are. And I'm going to introduce them now very shortly. First of all, we have Dr. Kavus Abushov, who's Associate Professor of Political Science of Ada University in Baku. Richard Giragosian, Director of the Regional Studies Center in Yerevan. Matt Bryza, non-resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, also former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia, and a former member of the OSCE Minsk Group. And last but not least, Nigar Göksel, who's the Project Director for Turkey at the Crisis Group. Just before we start, a note to the audience. If you would like to ask a question or have a comment, please can you either click on the hand icon or alternatively type a question into the Q&A box. So I want to start at the beginning here. First of all, actually with Kavus and Richard, I want to put the first question to them. I mean, a lot of things have happened over the last year. I mean, both positive and development things. And I would like to get both of your views on the current state of play. I mean, what's going on at the moment? What are the prospects for peace and stability? And what are the biggest obstacles that you see to be overcome? And maybe we start with you, Kavus, and then follow up with Richard.
Sure, thanks, Fiona. My name actually ends up with an S, not SH. Right. I think the war was tragic. Let me start emphasizing that. Why tragic? Because I think the current status quo could have been achieved without the war. Had there been certain conditions on the ground. I and Richard have attended negotiations a number of times. So we have met at different platforms. I've met other colleagues from Armenia as well. And we'd always emphasize that a lot of effort should be taken, should be put to avoid the war. Because I think one did not really need that much to achieve the current status quo peacefully. Yes. So what do we have currently? We have, from the Azerbaijani perspective, let's say, we have the occupied regions outside Nagorno-Karabakh that have been liberated. We have Shusha and we have Hadrut. But Shusha is of particular importance to Azerbaijan because of its identity, cultural identity, and so forth. This could have been achieved before without any single bullet shot. Why I'm emphasizing this is because currently, back to your question, Fiona, I think currently the situation is quite positive. I see it quite positively. How to say, there are positive messages. There are a lot more positive messages, a lot more, how to say, more hope now than immediately after the war. Yes, in the immediate aftermath of the war, there were mixed feelings, but this is normal. And what is the cause of my optimism? The cause of my optimism is the pragmatism I've been observing on both sides. On the Azerbaijani side, the Azerbaijani president is taking a very pragmatic approach. He's been saying, emphasizing that Karabakh Armenians are nationals of Azerbaijan. He's been emphasizing that trade links need to be opened up. He's been emphasizing that communication needs to be restored. And he's not said it openly, explicitly, but he's probably leaving out a political settlement towards the end, although he says explicitly that the conflict is settled. But the Azerbaijani government in that regard is in line with Russia's position that any issues related to the status, so you mentioned at the beginning, Fiona, political settlement attached to the process, that needs to be left towards the very end. Back last December, starting from last December, Russian president and the foreign minister have emphasized repeatedly that the status, anything related to the status, needs to be left towards the end, and they're very hopeful that the status will melt down in the process of trust building, restoration of communication, etc. So in this regard, I think particularly in the last few months, I've been observing positive messages on the Azerbaijani side. I've been observing also positive messages on the Armenian side. Today I read in the press a statement by the president of Armenia, Armen Sarkisyan, I think, who was saying that Armenia has to normalize relations with Azerbaijan. Prime Minister Pashinyan is also made a number of similar statements. Of course, it's not as smooth as we think. I mean, a few days ago there was tension, not a few days ago, but on the 8th of December there was tension again when Armenia's defense minister paid a visit to Nagorno-Karabakh. And so this was, this was seen as a symbolic gesture, as a negative gesture in Azerbaijan. But this is, I think, if you ask me, this is a minor issue. And another cause for my optimism is Russia's position. Russia, unlike its role in other frozen conflicts, Russia is playing a constructive role. It is supportive of the normalization of relations. Yes, it is supportive. It's not a priority for it to resolve the conflict immediately, but we know that we're not talking about immediate resolution. Now, you mentioned also obstacles. The primary obstacle, how I see it, is the wounds are still very fresh. There was a war a year ago. Do you know how many people have lost their loved ones on both sides? This is not so easy to digest. And this also creates some tension that sometimes goes to the macro level, state level. Yes, I mean, certain things that are done in Armenia is not perceived, is perceived with a lot of anger, and vice versa. Yes, so one needs to understand that the wounds are fresh, and the governments cannot accelerate this process of how to say, of smelting the hatred or the enmity between the societies. That I see as the number one obstacle. But I see the process largely in a new functional way, that small steps will lead to a normalization of relations. This is something I remember we'd emphasized 2 years ago in a seminar where Richard was present as well in Georgia. I don't remember the exact date, that one day the conflict will be resolved. And we talked about this scenario actually, that it will be resolved based upon modus vivendi, but the biggest obstacle afterwards will be the wounds. The wounds are very fresh. And finally, I would like to touch upon the issue of the geopolitical issue. Yes, you mentioned that Russia and Turkey are the so-called winners, and I see Russia as the primary winner. I see Azerbaijani side has also been quite satisfied with the result. You mentioned Iran's role diminishing, but Iran had never had such a big role in this conflict. I mean, apart from 1990s, I don't see the tension between Iran and Azerbaijan to be so much directly related to this conflict, and I don't see how Iran can get in, or how to say any deterioration in the relations between Azerbaijan and Iran can influence the peace process. Okay, that's all I wanted to say, and then I would be happy to answer the questions. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Kavus. Just to say, my name is not Fiona. My name's Amanda. Maybe you were thinking of Fiona Hill. Then I should be very flattered.
Sorry, Amanda.
No, it's okay. But thank you very much for your initial comments. I mean, I have to say, you were very positive. Huh? I mean, you talked about hope in pragmatism, small steps towards normalization, and then the point you made about the status issue will melt down and maybe disappear. So I'd like now to pass over to Richard to see if he shares your optimism and hope, or if he has a different view, and to get his ideas on what he thinks are the main challenges and obstacles now, and look back a bit over the past 1 year.
Thanks, Amanda, and thank you very much for the opportunity in organizing this event. First, I want to focus on a stark, realistic appraisal of where we are before going into more optimistic assessments. I see specifically two significant fundamental obstacles. The first, of course, is the fact that we have a very fragile, vulnerable ceasefire. And it is not even Russian brokered, it was Russian imposed. And in this context, the ceasefire is just that, a basic agreement to halt hostilities. It does not include more forward-looking provisions about a return to diplomacy or a resumption of the peace process. In terms of a significant obstacle, however, the implementation of the terms of the ceasefire are what concerns me most. In other words, Azerbaijan has been very good at openly defying Moscow in terms of a failure to return Armenian prisoners of war, border tension, border escalation, incursions in Armenian territory. This does much to undermine the validity and the confidence of the ceasefire agreement. At the same time, the loss of life is also an additional element showing the weakness of the ceasefire. The loss of life was most notable only in the last couple of days as well. What we see here is a related weakness. In addition to the ceasefire fragility, the absence of engagement and the lack of direct negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan addressing the underlying conflict. Having said that, where there is grounds for optimism is the turning point in September. On the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly, we do see a very welcome resumption of diplomatic meetings and negotiations where the Armenian and Azerbaijani foreign ministers met. This is very important also in terms of restoring and even resurrecting the OSCE Minsk group mediators. And diplomacy is the only way forward, not the force of arms or the bellicose threats coming in terms of discourse. A second area of optimism is the one area of positive progress over the past year. The working group on the restoration of regional trade and transport. This working group is close to unveiling a breakthrough agreement beginning with a road and railway link from Azerbaijan to its exclave Nakhichevan. Unfortunately, this agreement was recently delayed. Russia is now trying to broker a video online session to announce and to finalize this breakthrough agreement. Both the resumption of diplomacy and the outlook for regional trade and transport is the rare positive element here. But for Armenia, the pressing urgency is the return of prisoners of war. And in effect, this open wound is keeping both the pain and the pressure from the war very much alive and very much a challenge. Having said that, there is both an opportunity and an opening for Western engagement and European Union engagement. And this is based on what I would say is an accidental convergence of interests between the West and Moscow in post-war stability, where the opposite of Crimea applies, where the return of the Minsk group, France and the United States as co-chairs with Russia, will legitimize a unilateral Russian military deployment to Nagorno-Karabakh, the opposite of Crimea. At the same time, Moscow seems quite eager to have the European Union re-engage in order to finance or pay the cost of post-war stability. So this realignment is an accidental convergence of interests. Nevertheless, the outlook for post-war stability with the return of diplomacy, Western re-engagement, also opens the door for Armenia-Turkey normalization. And in conclusion, I would say what's most notable is there is no conclusion. This is very much a dynamic, ongoing process, and it's not static in any way, but we are moving forward.
Thank you, Richard. I think this was also quite an optimistic assessment as well. Maybe not as optimistic as Kavus, but still optimistic. But maybe I could just ask you a follow-on question, because you mentioned the meeting, the last meeting under the auspices of the OSCE Minsk group. I mean, are there any plans for a follow-up to this? I mean, for this sort of political engagement, or was it a once-off and we may have to wait some time for the next meeting?
Oh, no, there was and is a concrete agreement for the OSCE Minsk group to return to the region before the end of the year. And according to many reports, they will also visit Nagorno-Karabakh, interestingly, from the Azerbaijani side. But in effect, the OSCE Minsk group is driving this return or resumption of diplomacy. And in many ways, the French and American co-chairs have salvaged the OSCE mediating body, but it's also very much in Russia's interest.
Thank you, Richard. I'm now going to turn to you, Nigar, to look a bit about the role of Turkey and the goals that Turkey has in the region. I mean, Turkey's footprint there has significantly enlarged, let's say, over the last 1 year. So maybe you can give us a sort of an overview of Turkey's goals now going forward, the role that it's playing there in the South Caucasus, and the objectives, I mean, in the bigger picture of Turkish foreign policy in the broader region.
Thanks, Amanda. I think my internet's a little unstable, so warn me if I seem to be losing sound. And I mean, I think what Turkey's vision has been for quite a long time, has been economic integration of the region, and this is not new. And it's also not new that Azerbaijan is the central country for Turkey's strategic hold in the Caucasus, and that's ever more the case now. But I find in Ankara, and I'm not relating, I mean, I'm mostly relating my observations of Ankara's perspective, so I may be misreading some things. But I think there is an orientation now to normalize relations with Armenia, but really very much and managing it very delicately. In a way, the sort of optimism in a gradual process, the way that Kavus outlined, is the line that I also hear a lot in Ankara. Well, things will be incremental. Trust will be built as benefits, mutual benefits are transport and whatnot. I think there's a very strong caution about to ensure that Azerbaijan and Russia can see interests as well in Turkey-Armenian normalization, because if they perceive otherwise, if they perceive their interests are being worked against, then a process. And so the frame within which Turkey is functioning now is some kind of integration that will benefit all parties and be more sustainable than a sort of ceremonial one-time event. I think in the long integration can give Turkey an edge over Russia. Turkey's upper hand, I mean, the sort of soft power interdependence frame can eventually curb Russia, but can eventually make Turkey a stronger power. But I don't think that there's to make anything look like it's designed to curb Russian power or Russia's grip is very much stood against in Ankara. And that's where I might mention Western involvement, where I think that for Turkey, Amanda, you mentioned that the West needs to be more involved. And I still hear similar things, caveats that they shouldn't come in with a view to sort of revive the Cold War, that they need to not act like they're trying to elbow out Russia, because that's bound to backfire. It's a losing battle. It'll leave all sides worse off. These are the kind of phrasings that I hear. I think Western soft power is very welcome. Financing of projects, expertise on infrastructure, humanitarian issues, bottom-up work, reconciliation. What the advantage of Europe could be, at least as seen in Ankara, I think is those kind. I think it's time for a direct contact between Turkey and Armenia officially. I think sooner rather than later would be better, because there's also a lot of miscommunication or messages lost in translation. I mean, webinars are great, but and also media statements, but they can also, there's a lot of ambiguity and already been taking place. I think Turkey is very careful about keeping Baku in the loop at every single stage, every single communication that is had with all the actors, including Russia, the United States, European partners, and Armenia, of course. Not that there's any direct communication. Objection in Baku to Ankara's sort of the prospect of Turkey-Armenia normalization. As long as they're not left in the dark, and as long as, of course, the connection to Nakhchivan is always very important. So there's a little bit of a tit for tat that also has to be in the works approach that I pick up. But otherwise, what I hear from Ankara, Azerbaijan is receptive to points made that there could be a positive spillover effect to Azerbaijan as well, for Turkey and Armenia to start gradually normalizing, sort of mellowing the hostility or empowering constructive circles in Armenia. I think think there's a sense of skepticism a little bit in officials that Yerevan can follow through, and that there's this, and it might not be true, but there's this observation that in order to extend a sort of outreach to Turkey and yet prove nationalist credentials, that Armenian officials are prone to harden their rhetoric towards Azerbaijan more. But you're showing that you're tough on the other ground, and what they say is that's only going to drive us to sort of to tell Baku, don't worry, there's no joining of forces with Armenia against Azerbaijan. So I see that that theme is very much in Ankara's mind, that there should be no sort of any normalization with Turkey is at the expense of Azerbaijan. I think civil society is very much out of the scene. Even media has been very weak in Turkey in terms of coverage of Caucasus affairs and many other priorities in the country. And the people that used to be interested in in platforms where their voices can be heard. And so that's an issue. I think that moving forward, we're going to need to bring in new circles in civil society to support the. Really, in the past, there was some of the work done as Azerbaijan, sort of people-to-people contact, dismissed Azerbaijan grievances. That didn't pan in a way that had policy impact. So there are thoughts that I hear in Turkey of how you sort of have a 2.0 approach, that there's more civil society that is not kept to very narrow groups, but widened. Perhaps I'll leave it at that, and I'll save the rest for question and answers.
Okay, thank you, Nigar. I'll come back to you again later on some other points related to this Turkey-Armenia rapprochement. But I just like now to give the floor to Matt. I mean, Matt, you've been a figure in this region for a very long time in different capacities. So of course it will be very interesting to hear, somebody from the outside, if I can put it that way, how you view the new dynamics in the region. If you feel this, positive vibe, and what you see are the challenges, and also if you could perhaps touch on, the role or non-role of the United States as you're an American, and what you see what the Americans could be doing more in the region.
Sure, thanks, Amanda. Yeah, an honor to be together with, especially with you, my dear friend and dear friends Richard and Nigar and Kavus. Very happy to meet you without an H at the end. I'm optimistic too, and I'm optimistic for the following reasons. One, the ceasefire agreement that, as Richard said, was imposed by Russia. Of course, it was on Prime Minister Pashinyan on Armenia, but was done because it is more or less in keeping with the so-called basic principles or Madrid principles that were put on the table back in November 2007 at the OSCE foreign ministers meeting in Madrid. That's why they're called the Madrid principles. And I'll go into that in more detail, but we should keep in mind that on the day that we, the co-chairs of the Minsk group, proposed these principles, Azerbaijan rejected it. I'll never forget then Foreign Minister Elmar Mammadov saying, no way, these are not in our interests. And we, as the co-chairs, Russia, French, and myself, were crestfallen. We thought, oh my gosh, like we've negotiated this for a couple of years. It seemed like both sides agreed in principle, and now Azerbaijan has basically threatened to tear them up. In subsequent years, Azerbaijan came to support those basic principles. And so what are they? First of all, the idea is fundamentally a land for peace formula, whereby the lands, the Nagorno-Karabakh and the 7 surrounding territories return to Azerbaijan, and in exchange, Armenia and Armenians get peace, get security guarantees in crude form. Security guarantees in the form of a peacekeeping force. We never knew who would provide that peacekeeping force? The logical organization would have been the OSCE, but they've never fielded a peacekeeping force. They field observer missions, but not peacekeepers. So we never really worked it out, but we are operating from a perspective that, hello, that, there should be no participants to the conflict that provide peacekeepers and no neighbors. So that would have excluded Russia. So, okay, we didn't get the same type of peacekeepers that we were contemplating back in 2007, 8, and 9, but nonetheless, there are peacekeepers. There also is, we talked at that point also about the normalization of economic relations, the reopening of transit. But what is absent, of course, from the ceasefire statement of November 9-10 is any talk, as we were discussing in the beginning, of a potential change in the legal status of Karabakh or Nagorno-Karabakh. What was in the basic principles was the idea that, number one, immediately upon agreement of those basic principles, Nagorno-Karabakh gets something called interim legal status. What does that mean? Who knows? We were using constructive ambiguity as our friend to diffuse the whole issue of legal status, because Azerbaijan said, we're not going to negotiate if the change in legal status of Nagorno-Karabakh is on the table. And the Armenian side was saying, we're not going to negotiate unless we're guaranteed of a change in the legal status. So with no way to proceed in that situation on the diplomatic path, we said, let's use constructive ambiguity as our friend. We'll say Nagorno-Karabakh gets immediately something called interim legal status, to be defined. It meant that the people, the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh would be able to run their own affairs and would pretty much have de facto a state of autonomy that is kind of every attribute of full autonomy or even independence, except being independent, or except being unambiguously at that point part of Azerbaijan. But ambiguity was the key. And the question of the final legal status of Nagorno-Karabakh would have been something deferred to the future that would have been determined by either a population vote or a referendum. I mean, both sides were arguing over, can there be a referendum? Azerbaijan was saying, no, there can't be a referendum on the Azerbaijani constitution. Armenia is saying that's absurd. Of course there can be a referendum. So, but they agreed in principle that there'd be a vote by the residents of Nagorno-Karabakh sometime in the future, could have been in 5 months, 5 years, or 500 years, or 50 years, that would determine the final legal status. And so the idea was reduce the risk of war to a minimum by giving both sides what they want in principle, but then negotiate for a while in the state of constructive ambiguity until you could agree a peace settlement. So that agreement, by the way, that was on the table by my reading throughout the war, including, I think there was an October 10th ceasefire, and then there was another one that when the parties went to Moscow, and it kind of got fudged later on in Paris. But up until early November, according to what I've read and the amazing interview of President Putin around the 3rd or 5th of November, that package was on the table. And there's this astounding interview I just mentioned where President Putin said, I offered this to Prime Minister Pashinyan, and he said no, because that package agreement, whatever you want to call it, Madrid principles, would involve Azerbaijanis returning to their former residences, and they'd live side by side with Armenians. And that's politically infeasible for us right now, or unacceptable. So no, we're not going to accept that. The fighting continued. You got to November 9 and 10th after Azerbaijan gained or regained Shusha. And what was agreed, and yes, imposed by Moscow, is essentially all the stuff I talked about regarding the basic principles without mention of a change in legal status. And so going back to what Kavus said in the very beginning, yeah, you could have achieved all of that, plus the change in legal status to something ambiguous from unambiguously being part of Karabakh without the war, had those Madrid principles been finalized, and had the October 10th ceasefire proposal been accepted. But it wasn't possible for Prime Minister Pashinyan for domestic political reasons. I get it. But I agree very much with what Kavus said in the beginning, that this could have all been accomplished without a bullet being fired. But we are where we are. So what does this all mean? I didn't want to just lay out all these details. It means to me that the September 9-10th ceasefire statement provides a workable framework for a future peace agreement. Why is that? Because in January of 2009, then President of Armenia, South Sarkisian, then and current President of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, agreed unofficially to that framework I outlined with all those components. They agreed to it. In Zurich, it happened to be at the very romantic Radisson Blue Zurich Airport Hotel as they were going up to Davos for the, all those wonderful World Economic Forum sessions. But they said, yeah, unofficially, this framework makes sense to us. And now we got to finalize the details. And, in the intervening or the subsequent 11 years, they never finalized the details for all sorts of reasons we could go into, probably don't have time. Bottom line is, though, what was stated on November 9 and 10th is more or less what was agreed in principle in 2009, but now without status on the table. Okay, so then the next set of points is, of course, in the immediate aftermath of this statement and the end of the war, Armenian domestic politics went haywire. And a lot of people, like myself, were predicting that Pashinyan isn't going to survive. Certainly not politically and maybe not physically, right? We all remember that there were rumors while those street demonstrations were happening, there was an assassination plot against him. Richard can comment on whether or not that was ever true. But it looked like Pashinyan was not long for this political world. And that, going into it, Vladimir Putin did not like Nikol Pashinyan, didn't want him in power. Pashinyan came to power via the route that is terrifying for Putin, right? A popular, pro-Western, peaceful street demonstration. But then what happened? Putin imposed the ceasefire agreement. That is Putin's. He owns that. Pashinyan signed on the bottom line. So suddenly Pashinyan became essential to Putin to keep that agreement on which Putin placed so much of his personal prestige. So suddenly Putin needs Pashinyan. And that got us to the June parliamentary elections in Armenia, where Pashinyan's political fortunes rose and he won a decisive victory. And since then, I've seen, and again, others, please, you'll tell me I'm crazy, especially Richard, but I've seen the mood politically changing on the ground in Armenia. And now we see that Prime Minister Pashinyan is saying, in crude terms, yes, let's find ways to normalize relations with Turkey and with Azerbaijan. Yes, let's find a way to demarcate our border, international border between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Yeah, let's find ways to reopen the transportation routes and attract investment. So if that sea change in Armenian politics is real, if I'm not just smoking something or like overly optimistic as I am sometimes prone to be, then there's a new dynamic and a new trajectory that I sense very much in Azerbaijan. The leadership there wants to embrace, because for Azerbaijan to cement this ceasefire statement's basic provisions and to be seen now as the country that can catalyze investment, that can benefit not just Azerbaijanis or not just Turkish investors, but Armenians as well, create jobs. Yes, reopen the transportation links, generate wealth, create interconnectivity on transportation and energy transit and road transit, but do more, create productive industries, in these recovered territories, but also on Armenian territory. That's something that will make Azerbaijan in international limelight look, quote unquote, good. It will play on what I think a lot of Azerbaijanis are proud of, in that they believe, the immediate aftermath of the war, by quote unquote allowing the Armenians that were in Kalbajar to have 10 more days to leave, or facilitating humanitarian aid shipments, that was something good. Granted, under international humanitarian law, Azerbaijan had an obligation to do that, of course, or facilitating natural gas shipments when the pipeline to Armenia broke, what wasn't functioning. That Azerbaijan did things that are good, that will hopefully gain it, credit in the eyes of the international community. So there's an incentive in Azerbaijan as well to be seen as doing the right thing. Of course, this can all collapse in a moment, but I hope that the force of international investment and new ways to move natural gas into Armenia, even from Turkmenistan, via Iran, perhaps, via cross-Caspian pipeline, and then into Armenia via Azerbaijan, those create really powerful new opportunities to reintegrate all the economies in the region, Georgia included, though I understand why Georgia is getting a little nervous that maybe these new corridors won't include Georgia in the critical way that it was needed before. But of course, including investment by international community, by Turkish investors, by Azerbaijanis, into this regional economy that involves Armenia in a profound way. That is realistic. Perhaps not politically yet, but I think it's becoming an economic reality. Finally, just my last comment on having the EU be more involved in negotiations. I think that's critical. I've advocated that since I was a co-chair. I mean, I love France as much as the next person, but in terms of diplomatic heft, the EU brings a lot more to the table, financially, but also, in terms of its political weight. And so I don't know what the future of the Minsk group is. You asked me about the US role, Amanda, and I'll wrap it up here. I don't think anyone in Washington besides us specialists is paying any attention at all, not only not to the South Caucasus, but very little attention to Turkey, except in a negative sense, right? With the brand of Turkey still being toxic, especially in the US Congress. I think President Biden himself is looking for a way to improve US-Turkey relations through the possible sale of US F-16 technology. Yet there are at least 40 members of Congress who are saying, never, over our dead bodies, that's not going to happen. And if the F-16 sales don't happen, I think we'll see another new downward spiral in US-Turkey relations. And if that happens, there's going to be no senior level focus on the South Caucasus then, if Turkey and the US are in a new crisis, unfortunately. So the Minsk group, if it's US, France, which is problematic with France because it's seen as having chosen one side in this conflict, pushing for immediate discussions of status, whereas Azerbaijan, Russia, Turkey wanted to delay that. If that's the content of the Minsk group, I'm going to say Sostaf, I can't get the Russian word out of my mind. Then I think Azerbaijan's going to resist really engaging with the Minsk group. Maybe encourage it to help with demarcating and defining the international border between Azerbaijan and Armenia, and maybe strengthening the ceasefire along the new line of contact. But we're going to have to get to a point, the parties have to get to a point where they're going to negotiate a real peace agreement. That's going to take years. Hopefully the Minsk group can help do that. But I think in this new reality, Russia is going to be the key actor. And maybe the EU will be able to provide a counterbalancing role as well. I sure as God and hope that the US and France will play that role as well. But Washington's attention is terribly diverted right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. This was a very all-encompassing, if I can put it that way, picture of many different things, which was very fascinating and really shows how much you've been engaged in the region for many years. And there's actually a lot of points to be picked up on what you have just said. Particularly, I think many of them are for Richard, but I want to come to Richard actually in a second, and I want to come back to Kavus to come back to this issue of the Minsk group and Azerbaijan's readiness to re-engage in this process, particularly on this issue that's just been mentioned, on this issue of status. Because we know very well that for Azerbaijan, as you mentioned at the beginning, there is going to be no status. This is something that could have had in the past, the Armenians living in that part of Nagorno-Karabakh now, they're all Azerbaijani citizens, and they should be integrated back into Azerbaijan one way or another during a longer term process. So I would like to hear your views on where you think, what direction you think that the Minsk group should be going in the next few months, but also related to the steps that are being taken by the Azerbaijani side to actually reach out to the Armenian population of Nagorno-Karabakh, to make them believe that Azerbaijan is actually serious, that they can be trusted, etc. Because I think there have been some incidents over the last months, unfortunate incidents, which would sort of wouldn't give the right impression. This needs to be a sort of campaign to win hearts and minds, if I can put it that way. Is this something that Azerbaijan has in mind? Because it's not clear to me what are the concrete measures in terms of reconciliation that are going to take place? I mean, also in terms of, you know, confidence building steps, you know, what role do you see for the EU and other international actors in helping in this process?
Quite a lot of questions actually, Amanda, but they're very interesting. Thank you. Let me start of a few things. Richard mentioned that the ceasefire is fragile. There I disagree with Richard, because I don't think the ceasefire is fragile, at least at the political level. Why? As long as the Russian peacekeepers are there, the ceasefire is not going to be fragile. So I think the military phase of the conflict is over. I don't think there's going to be another military phase of this conflict. And that brings me, that is the cause of my optimism. Now, Richard also mentioned that there was absence of political engagement at the top level. As I mentioned, this is one should not really underestimate the feelings on both sides. So this is going to be a very slow process, but it's happening now. As you mentioned, Richard, that the foreign ministers met. So I wouldn't rule out, exclude the possibility of the heads of state meeting either this year or the latest next year. But this is a slow process. A lot, do you understand? A lot of has happened, so one cannot overcome it so quickly. It's going to be a very slow process. What is positive is that the military phase is over. Now, the Minsk group, you mentioned the Minsk group. Azerbaijani president and the government has said it very clearly that they don't rule out the Minsk group. They are prepared to work with the Minsk group, but there's a big question. What would be the scope of the Minsk group at this current stage, at this current level? To be honest, I don't see much role for the Minsk group now. Perhaps in the future, in the normalization, the Minsk group could play a potential role in the normalization, facilitating communication, restoration of communication between Azerbaijan, Karabakh Armenians, and Armenia itself, and trust building and all that confidence building. But for the current stage, what I see, there are a few urgencies. I mean, I don't see the Minsk group in this first stage. What I see in the first stage is Russia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, direct negotiations with the assistance or support of Russia, and then I see the need for greater cooperation on a number of functional issues like landmines. As Armenia should be supporting Azerbaijan as much as possible to identify those landmines that have been laid by the Armenian armed forces. That is because, unfortunately, since the ceasefire, around 40 people have died on the landmines in Azerbaijan side. Now, this is all part of a dilemma. Call it a security dilemma, a political dilemma, whatever, because there's also the issue of detainees, Armenian detainees in Azerbaijan, and that needs to be tackled as well. That needs to be resolved sooner the better. So you see, in this process, I think the Minsk group is just going to add fuel to the flame. I think it cannot really. Do you understand? Partly, the Minsk group is a source of anger in both Armenia and Azerbaijan, because the Minsk group lost its credibility. In a way, the Minsk group failed to facilitate it. I'm not really blaming anybody, Matthew in particular. I'm not blaming anybody. The Minsk group had no power to enforce any solution upon anybody. The Minsk group was to find. So I'm familiar with the. I have understanding. However, as I said, the Minsk group at this level, I don't see much scope for the Minsk group. Now, winning the hearts and minds. I think things are still very, Amanda, the conflict parties have not reached that stage yet, I think. Things are still premature for that. Azerbaijani government is now gradually thinking of that, of programs to win the hearts and minds of the Armenian population. But it's not, I mean, suppose, if you ask me as an expert, I don't think any program right now will work, because things are, again, the wounds are fresh. And I think, again, winning the hearts and minds of the Armenian population of Northern Karabakh, there are other priorities. The priorities, again, delimitation of the boundaries, landmine map, and Armenian political detainees. These are the top priorities. Winning the hearts and minds will require some time. So therefore, I think the neo-functional approach, the theoretic neo-functional approach, is the best one that I see here, that let us leave the status or whatever, let us leave the normalization of relations, sort of winning the hearts and minds of the population towards the very end. This is going to be a very lengthy process of confidence building, trust building, and so forth. But Amanda, I completely agree with you that this needs to start at some point. In particular, the conflict parties will realize sooner or later that they have a lot in common, actually. Yes, these two nations have a lot in common. To start with, they're both human, and they both have sufferings and feelings and others. During the recent war, I remember BBC footages of people in Armenia speaking about the war and so on and forth. And it was interesting to see that some were caught by surprise. Some were saying, why is Azerbaijan doing this? Why is that? So it seemed there'd been lack of communication, the two societies had been completely isolated away from each other. That, you see, this is going to be an overall lengthy process, but it has started. And important, as Matthew Bryza also mentioned, is that Russia, which should not be underestimated, is playing a positive role in the process overall. I think I've answered all your major questions, I hope, Amanda, or is there anything left?
No, that's fine for the moment, Kavus. Thank you very much. And I want to come back to Richard. Maybe Richard would like to respond on some of the things that you said, but I would also like to ask Richard now about the dynamic in Russia-Armenian relations, because I mean, there's an impression certainly here in Brussels and in the EU that the influence that Russia now has over Armenia has significantly grown to the point where, you know, perhaps the Russians can sort of strong arm Armenia into agreeing to some things that it may not want to. So I would be interested to hear your views on this. I mean, the role of Russia here, and also to come back to what Nigar was talking about. I mean, the Turkey-Armenia rapprochement. I mean, how do you see this? I mean, is this something that can progress rather rapidly? Is it time to move from, you know, words into actions? And I mean, how is Armenian, you know, society? I mean, are they prepared for this? I mean, is there support for it from society?
Thanks for the question, Amanda. Let's look at Russia first. In many ways, there's an interesting parallel, or even a paradox. Russian power and influence in the region, from a superficial assessment, looks much stronger. Russia has emerged as the clear winner from the war, despite a much larger direct investment of military support from Turkey to Azerbaijan. It was Russia that came in and swept the prize. If we look at a peacekeeping deployment in Nagorno-Karabakh, it's most significant because this was the only conflict without a Russian military presence. So Russia now militarily is present in all three countries of the South Caucasus, full stop. What's also interesting is, despite this superficial projection of power, Russia is stemming from a position of weakness, not strength. For the first time ever, there's a self-imposed 5-year deadline on the peacekeeping deployment. In addition, Azerbaijan throughout the war had openly challenged Moscow, refusing several attempts by Russia to broker a ceasefire agreement. Azerbaijan openly defied Moscow and still does. It's calling the bluff of the Kremlin, and it's based on Azerbaijan's national interest. In Armenia, however, there is a rather impressive expansion of Russian presence and power. But I would argue, although the Armenians of what's left of Nagorno-Karabakh are looking to Moscow, not Yerevan, for their physical safety and security. They depend on the Russian peacekeepers, not on Armenia. However, the real development was a Russian military buildup in southern Armenia that has nothing to do with Nagorno-Karabakh. It's distinct and separate. And Russia has acquired Armenia's external border with Azerbaijan, giving them, Russia, control over 3 of Armenia's 4 external borders: Armenia-Turkey, Armenia-Iran, and in the looming present, Armenia-Azerbaijan. Moreover, every agreement on the restoration of regional trade and transport is predicated on Russian management and control. It is Eurasian Economic Union and Russia that will actually ensure the connectivity between Azerbaijan and Nakhchivan through southern Armenia. Nevertheless, there was an important breakthrough in this agreement in terms of Armenian sovereignty is guaranteed and recognized by Azerbaijan. This is not a corridor as it was originally demanded by the Azerbaijani government. So this is a breakthrough. Moreover, in terms of the regional trade and transport projects, the link to Nakhchivan is only the first step in a broader package. Nevertheless, this is very much a Russian managed process, meaning there's an underlying threat to Georgia, to where Russia seeks to isolate and marginalize Georgia as the transit state. Armenia's benefit is to overcome isolation in terms of the promise of trade and economics. In this context, economics and trade, for the first time ever, are now priorities and incentives for post-war stability. Never before were they recognized as such. And to be honest, the reason I'm optimistic is we have an agreement between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Russia, beginning with Nakhchivan, for road and railway transit. And the agreement is due to be signed, but broke down not because of the agreement, but because of the semantics and the theatrics of how and when the agreement will actually be finalized. And what's most important is there was an early test of this agreement with little public fanfare, and it wasn't road or rail traffic, it was air transport. Flights from Turkey to Baku and from Baku to Nakhchivan now, for the past month, regularly transit Armenian airspace. This was the confidence building measure and the trial balloon for the road and railway breakthrough. And again, this is the first in a larger stage of incremental steps. Looking to Turkey, I argue that Turkey's motivation for normalization with Armenia is dominated by a very pragmatic recognition that Russia excluded Turkey from the trilateral working group on trade and transport. For Turkey, normalization with Armenia, the reopening of the border, gives Turkey a seat at the table in terms of the regional dynamic. In many ways, in this context, Armenia-Turkey normalization from Ankara's perspective is not about Yerevan, it's about Moscow, with Azerbaijan, unlike the past, being much more permissive. At the same time, don't forget, the closed border is not between Turkey and Armenia alone. It's between Turkey and the Eurasian Economic Union. And it's Russian-owned sectors of the Armenian economy that benefit first and benefit most from a reopening of the border. And unlike the protocols in the past, which were signed between Armenia and Turkey but not implemented, Azerbaijan is no longer the spoiler. And in fact, there's a broader constituency for normalization. And I do think Nigar Göksel's points were not only accurate, but also insightful, basically given her own expertise, but also the work of the International Crisis Group and looking at the broader regional challenges. And I do think it's a rare game changer, a positive development moving forward. But let me finish by saying what normalization is not. It's not reconciliation. This is the basic minimum of neighbors having diplomatic relations and normal open borders, and that's all. It's a foundation and a prerequisite for the eventual reconciliation. But I do think normalization between Armenia and Turkey will only help in terms of ending the demonization of all sides between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Absolutely, Richard. I totally agree with you on that point. And maybe we can stay on this topic and come back to you now, Nigar. Maybe you can. I mean, what do you think are going to be the next steps in terms of the normalization process? And what do you think could be, spoilers that could derail this? I mean, could the upcoming elections in Turkey, could this have, any role, or is this irrelevant? And maybe just linked to that, I could ask you about how you see how Turkey manages its relations with Russia in the South Caucasus. I mean, they managed to, rub by at the moment, okay, but I mean, could this dynamic change?
Thanks, Amanda. There's been so little discussion of this issue openly that I feel like I'm speculating. I haven't seen, at some point there was a concern that the nationalists in parliament and government would be sort of stand against normalization with Armenia. I haven't picked that up at all. Maybe, maybe it's going to come later, but when I've discussed with people, it seemed like their reservations had been lifted with Azerbaijan regaining the rayons that it did. That there didn't seem to be a resistance. The fact that the whole discussion of history, the genocide recognition issue in Washington, that's off the table. In a way, I think that gives some breathing space to everybody, because it's no longer an issue of how are we going to take up history, how are we going to prevent the the US president from using that word. And I think that has given more flexibility to Turkish actors, ironically. I think there's a division, not a division, but there are different circles in Ankara. And I think Matt talked about this the other day on another platform. There are some segments that are quite enthusiastic about working closely with Russia, and others that think that Turkey needs to sort of become a little tighter with the West in order to not be encircled and over sort of played too much by Moscow. So I think there are different trends in Ankara with regard to that. You asked about Russia. I think Russia's got some strong levers over Turkey, and outside of the theater of the Caucasus, I would say particularly in Syria, but they can spill over to each other. So for example, if Turkey does something that is irritating to Russia in the Caucasus, the answer sometimes can come from Idlib, which is a very, very sensitive spot for Turkey for a multitude of reasons, security reasons, public opinion, because refugees come flowing. It probably is the Achilles heel of Turkey in that relationship. So, I mean, it's a very multi-dimensional relationship. And I think when I talk to Turkish authorities, the word that I've heard a couple of times is it was the way it ended up in the Caucasus. I mean, between Armenia and Azerbaijan was not ideal. It's not ideal that it is the way it is, but this is the way it had to be. In terms of Russia being in the driving seat and having so much like convening, as Richard mentioned, the two sides without Turkey. I don't think there was any I don't think Armenia would have accepted Turkey to be at that table anyway. So that may have been out of the question in any case. And Turkey sees itself at the table indirectly because Azerbaijan is somehow passing notes back and forth, I'm sure, probably. Potential spoilers as the elections near. I mean, I don't think from within Turkey, at least, I can't see a big spoiler on the horizon. I think it's Azerbaijan. As much as we've been optimistic about Azerbaijan, I think Turkey will be looking very closely at Baku, and when Baku is comfortable with which steps it takes. I would agree, I can't remember who said it, maybe Amanda, maybe Richard, this sort of winning hearts and minds, reconciliation, very true. I think there's a sort of patriotic mobilization very much in the forefront in Azerbaijan, and it's a sort of swell of victory-related sentiments. And in Turkey, there's a very nationalistic sort of environment as well. And I think, in a way, to be inclusive of Armenians and to motivate them to be to dialogue or to be part of the proposed integration schemes, that needs to calm down a little bit. And maybe that will take time. But definitely, as it is right now, I think it's a turnoff for many Armenian circles to get together when they hear sort of some rhetoric. And I'm talking more, I know Turkey better, so I'll talk more about Turkey, but they often will also refer to Azerbaijan, where it's slowly, I think that the Armenian sort of feelings and sentiments also will need to be taken into consideration more if we want to get together around tables.
Thank you, Nigar. I'm going to quickly turn back to you, Matt. I want to put one of the questions that I have here to you, and it's about these regional frameworks. Can they help bilateral rapprochement? I mean, we know there's two regional frameworks that have been proposed, the 3+3 and then the one that was proposed by Georgia. Some people say they could, some other people say they're never going to go anywhere. So what do you think?
I think they can, and very much so. And it's hard for me to given my background and what I was doing in the U.S. government vis-a-vis Georgia and Russia, sometimes to say what I'm about to say. But as problematic as Russia seemed from my perspective in Washington in 2008 and lead up to its invasion of Georgia, my counterparts in Russia, including, not that he's my counterpart, but I mean Foreign Minister Lavrov himself, were totally constructive. My direct counterpart, Ambassador Yuri Merzlakov, always was looking for creative ways to move the process forward of the Minsk group and find ways to bridge differences. And Minister Lavrov often would host us in Moscow over lunch even, and hours of brainstorming. And one time, shortly after Russia invaded Georgia, he served this Georgian national soup called harcho. I said, Mr. Minister, wow, why are you serving that? He said, I want to show you that we're not just warmongers. We actually are serious about helping reach a peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So I think Russia really wants these mechanisms to work. Again, it's Putin's prestige that's on the line. And as Richard was saying, it's also a mechanism for Russia to further strengthen and broaden its influence in a broad sense in the Caucasus. Americans, when we think about foreign policy, we think about discrete problems that have solutions. And you are either the problem or you're a country that's going to work with us to resolve the problem. And Russia thinks in a much more abstract way. They think about the correlation of forces and influence in a general sense. And maybe doing something today that will be valuable tomorrow, even if you can't quite see how it's going to be of specific concrete value today. So by being the initiator and the prime mover of the 3+3 and the other formats and the Russia, Azerbaijan, Armenia Deputy Prime Ministerial level Commission on Infrastructure, Russia is cementing its preeminent role in the Caucasus. And finally, as Richard said, for the first time, has troops on the ground in Azerbaijan. And so I think those are very useful mechanisms because Russia is so vested in it. And somebody somebody has got to be there providing the political cover to help Armenian leaders say, yeah, let's go ahead and do this, because it's not going to be a sign of that I'm a traitor if I say I want to build economic reintegration in the region. No, this is something that Russia's pushing us to do, and we need to do it. And by the way, it's going to be better for Armenians as well. So I think that's a positive. I understand why Georgia's nervous, but I also think there's plenty of transportation demand to go around, whether it's container transport and energy. I mean, Baku, Tbilisi, Ceyhan, the South Caucasus gas pipeline, they're not going anywhere. And there's no plan anywhere in the near term for a gas pipeline through the Zangezur corridor. Hopefully there will be someday, and that'll deliver gas to Armenia as well. But that is, yeah, I mean, I'm fundamentally a business person now, right? That's nowhere on the horizon. No serious investors are talking about such a pipeline like that. But the transit routes to Georgia exist and are profitable and are going to keep on going. So I am 2 thumbs up for these regional cooperation mechanisms. I mean, you know, I was raised in the foreign service with problems with Iran, but Iran inevitably is going to be an important player regionally and economically, and it, you know, it's somehow at some point it needs to be integrated into the equation as well. And now under the Biden administration, there is a desire to find some ways to de-escalate tension with Iran, so we can U.S. can get back into the JCPOA. Whoops, sorry about that. This is a sign to me. I'm actually going to have to go because I'm in someone else's office. they want to go home, so I better yield my space. But I love this discussion. Thank you, and please reach out to me. Email any other way, and I'm ready to continue the dialogue with these wonderful minds here.
Thank you, Matt. It's always a pleasure to have you with us as well. I mean, we just have a couple of minutes left, so I just want to put a last question to actually Kavus and to Richard, because I mean, I'm sitting here in Brussels, so it has to be again about the EU. Charles Michel, he visited the region, and there was also the visit of the 3 ambassadors. I mean, but if there was something concrete that you would like to see the EU doing, what would it be? Because I think honestly the EU is rather lost over what it should or could be doing in the region. This would be the first question, and the second one actually is to you, Richard, because there was this question from Mr. Parviz Yerevan asking if the EU can be a balancing force to Russia in Armenia. So it seems to me that there's a desire to have the EU in the region. The EU is not sure what it's supposed to be, what it can do. So what do you want it to do?
Thank you very much. Looking at the EU, I'm much more optimistic. I do think it's no longer a question in this post-war environment of if, but when and how there will be greater EU engagement, specifically in 2 areas. One, connectivity. Connectivity inherently is what's driving the infrastructural restoration. The second area is technical expertise with the border demarcation process. Because we talked about the pending coming agreement on the restoration of trade and transport with a road and rail link from Azerbaijan to Nakhichevan. There's a related agreement, somewhat less expansive in scope, that is also ready to be signed. It's an agreement to provide a legal framework for a border demarcation commission based on Russian-provided reference maps from the Soviet period. No longer will there be ambiguity or clashes over which map applies. Russia has actually now taken the reins. This agreement will also allow for European Union technical expertise. So I would say connectivity as well as border demarcation technical expertise. But the other dynamic here is, for the first time ever, the European Union is seen as welcome by the Aliyev government in Azerbaijan. Previously, the Aliyev government was really not interested in any kind of association agreement or any kind of EU framework. Now, however, in terms of Azerbaijan's reconstruction and restoration programs and plans, there is a new willingness for the EU-Azerbaijani relationship to be deepened, and for Brussels which has little leverage in Baku, it's an important opening as well. So if we look at DG NEAR, the EU Special Representative, the External Action Service, I do think there are a lot of preparations being focused on right now once we get the green light to move forward.
Thank you. Kavus?
Yes. I agree with most of the points that Richard has mentioned. So I think the European Union can play a role in supporting the infrastructural developments. But in the midterm, I also see that the European Union could play a very important role in the confidence building measures between Armenians and Azeris overall. Yes, I think that, and I think there would be more trust, how to say, more acceptance of the European Union than the OSCE Minsk group in this role. Yes, so I think their EU could play a very positive role, and it has enough experience of its own in many other conflicts, including Northern Ireland conflict.
This is true. And my very last question to you, Nigar, because I mean, in the EU now, there's sort of a new discussion going on about revitalizing the dialogue between Turkey and the EU on security cooperation. I mean, is there the potential for greater engagement or at least dialogue between the two of them in the South Caucasus that could usefully help enhance the EU's position there, or whether they could both work together? Because I mean, there's been this problem of always seeing Turkey through the, let's say, the prism of a drone in the South Caucasus, but I think we're sort of starting to move away from that a bit.
No, I mean, I think there's a huge potential. I think there's a desire in Ankara as well. I think in Ankara, what I hear is this sort of frustration that of being presented as sort of first Syria and then Libya, now Azerbaijan, revisionist, expansionist Turkey. How are we going to prevent Turkey from gaining ground in these regions? That approach that it's heard in some European circles has invites a lot of pushback in Ankara, because I think it's precisely the Caucasus where you have a lot of interests aligned, maybe some short-term interests, but definitely long-term interests as well. This whole regional integration idea is sometimes presented in Ankara as exactly what the EU wanted, but maybe it's happening in a different way. It's going to connect that region east-west as well to Europe, and I think, in a sense, as much as Europeans often say that Turkey and Russia put their sort of joined forces and ended up reducing the influence of the West, I don't think that was a dynamic on that Ankara at least espouses, and I think they would like more European engagement as well. So in a sense, that's where we've all agreed as the panelists that, I mean, if Turkey also would like more European engagement, then I think the ball is in Europe's court.
Let's hope Europe picks the ball up, huh? So with that, I apologize that we went five minutes over time, but I need to bring this meeting to an end. So I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today and giving us your really interesting insights. I have to say that I'm leaving this meeting more positive than I imagined. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on. I mean, I think sometimes it's quite difficult to keep track of all of the dynamic and the engagements and the things that's moving in the South Caucasus. But it's good to see that things are going in a positive direction. And I hope that, you know, they remain that way. I mean, the EPC will continue to follow developments related to the region, to Nagorno-Karabakh, to Georgia, developments there and beyond. All of you have been very kind to join us in the past before, as well as today. So I hope that I can rely on you again in the future to continue this conversation on this topic. So I wish you all a great evening, and thanks to the audience for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Take care.